All right. Good evening, everyone. Please excuse the background noise that you may hear. I am currently on the North Carolina Confederate Monument Tour, where we are, along with our partners, visiting all the Confederate monuments that exist in public space on courtyards, in courthouses, and court grounds. And so I am in New Bern, North Carolina, in the lobby of my hotel, trying to ensure that my connection stays. And so Daniel and I are very grateful for everyone who is with us tonight. We are recording this webinar for people who registered, but who aren't able to, fully attend for whatever reason. And so it will be on for later viewing. Again, my name is Christy Puckett-Williams. I am the statewide campaign manager for Smart Justice with the ACLU of North Carolina. This is my colleague, Daniel. You want to introduce yourself, Daniel?
Yeah, good to be here with you again, Christy, for another one of these webinars. I feel like you're increasing the difficulty every time by being in a more inhospitable place. Yeah, thank you for pushing it and making it work. As Christy said, I'm her colleague at the ACLU of North Carolina. I serve as the Director of Policy and Advocacy. And yeah, just glad to be here with y'all for this webinar, and glad that Christy could take a little bit of time away from the Confederate Monument Tour.
So with that, y'all, we'll go ahead and get started. I'll start sharing my screen and just and we will have questions. Please put them either in the Q&A or in the chat, but we will not be looking at them until the end of the webinar, where we will look through the chat to answer any questions that you all may have. All right, so let's get started. Again, this is the People's University, Manufactured Scarcity, and we'll be talking and learning about budgets tonight. And we'll be learning how do budgets work? We'll be talking about state budgets, city and county budgets, and what do we mean by the manufactured scarcity? So hopefully you'll have a better understanding of that at the end of the night. So budgets, how do they work? What do you know about, Daniel, about budgets coming into this conversation? I know for me, I did not know a whole lot about budgets, but I've been through several sessions, cohorts, trying to learn more about budgets. And the more I dig into them, it feels like the less I know. Is that your experience?
Yeah, that, I think, my perception is largely colored by, generally what's happened over the last 10 years at the legislature, where some of the most intense battles at the General Assembly and between the General Assembly and the governor have been about the budget. And so, and it actually sort of, I think, people described it as politics hitting their sort of lowest, just hitting a low point when, there wasn't even a budget in the last fiscal year or the last biennium. They just couldn't come to an agreement.
Yes, thank you for that, Daniel. And so I know that the conversation around budgets came up a whole lot last year, especially as the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders began to take over the public consciousness. And people began talking about defunding and demilitarizing and reallocating and reinvesting money in community. And so in order for people to really understand what does that even mean, I think we have to have a baseline understanding of budgets. And what do people mean when they say defund the police? Do they really mean, what does that mean? I think this is an opportunity to unpack what does that really mean? Because for me, it means reallocating all of the money that we spend, ensuring that there are police and police gear and riot gear and helicopters and surveillance technology and tanks and chemical munitions, that we reinvest that money and redirect that money into public education, healthcare, and housing. So I think we'll get more into that as the conversation grows tonight. So why do budgets even matter? Why do we have a budget? I know in my household, we have to have a budget because there's only a certain amount of money coming in. That means only a certain amount can come out if we want to have money at the end of the month. And so pretty much the same thing when we think about the large budgets of our state and of our local governments. Most of us want to live in a community that is thriving. We want things that are well-staffed, such as those public schools that have teachers that enjoy their jobs, where they're well paid, and the schools are safe. We want streets that are accessible and easy to navigate and clean. We want universal health care and housing, public transportation that is accessible, that is fast, on time, efficient, and also affordable. And people need access to higher education. And budgets matter because ultimately they reflect our values and principles as a community. We really are showing how we feel about our community by what we fund or not fund. And so the budget affects each and every one of us because it's what elected officials use to enact the values. By allocating taxpayer dollars to programs and services, policymakers prioritize the ways they want to reflect those values in our daily lives. So what does that mean? That means that budgets should do several things. They should represent smart investments and supports that best achieve the goals that the community has. They should effectively match those investments with the growth that we need to see in our state and ensure that no matter where one lives and whether they are Black, brown, or white, they can access the same opportunities and quality of public services. So what are some key choices in the budgeting process? How much taxes to collect and who pays those taxes? How do we divvy up those dollars? And where to target spending and to which communities do we target that spending, that targeted spending? And I think you added this, Daniel, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, to sort of set the baseline at manufactured scarcity at the very beginning, it's important to realize that, when we're talking about the budget at the biggest, at the most simple level, we're talking about revenues and expenditures. And so, how much money you have to spend and then how much you spend. In North Carolina, there's actually a rule that says that the budget has to be balanced. So you can't expend more than sort of the revenue forecast. And so actually generating the revenue forecast is a big deal in North Carolina. And so, one of the things that led to the uncertainty over the last year was not knowing how COVID would affect the economy, but obviously believing that it would not be good. A lot of the states prepared and didn't spend money and their forecasts were very bleak. What's happened is that, in June of this year, they did a reassessment and there was a consensus forecast that actually was relatively rosy in the sense of that for the 2021 and 2022 fiscal year, the budget is supposed to be $2.3 billion. The revenue generated was $2.3 billion more than anticipated. And in 2022-23 fiscal year, it was again 2.2 billion more than anticipated when the forecast was made in February of 2021. And so those are adjustments that are being made. And again, that means that's how much legislators have to spend. And they rarely actually spend it all. They usually are not very aggressive at all in spending it.
And Daniel, I haven't looked recently, but at the last time I did look, there is at the state level a slush fund, a rainy day fund that the legislature has at their disposal. And at last count, that rainy day fund was at $6 billion. It's probably higher than that now, but that's just money that is sitting there. Can you tell people a little bit about how that slush fund came about?
Yeah, it really is. There's some sort of automatic sort of amount of money that has to pour into that as a slush fund. I think it's something like 15%, and I can't remember sort of what the category of it is. But what we've seen over the last, the big thing was that because there was no budget last year, that we've seen just a growth in a lot of these funds that are around. I mean, that's not the only, the rainy day fund is one fund that's out there, but there are others. But what we've seen is a very cautious, the Republican majority has pursued a very cautious approach in terms of spending and have generally cut taxes and, limited investments pretty dramatically. I will say that a lot of the apocalyptic forecast that you heard, 8 years ago, I don't think a lot of that has manifested. So I think that actually the revenues are higher than people expected. But it has been really characterized by a huge divestment from some of the basic institutions like education, like transportation, really across the board.
What I think was interesting to me, I was on a call last night with Senator Natasha Marcus out of Mecklenburg County, and she said that, an example of manufactured scarcity would be that we could fund Medicaid and Medicare for all right now in North Carolina without it costing taxpayers one dime. And the legislature refuses to fund it. And this is healthcare, universal healthcare for people living in our state, providing coverage oftentimes to the most poorest North Carolinians. And the families who are really strapped and who need that assistance. And so our, legislature refuses to fund that. So thank you, Daniel, for breaking that down for us. So what are the funding sources? When I go to work every day, so I work at the ACLU, right? My husband works every day. That's our funding sources for our personal income, for our personal budget, right? So we get money in because we work. How does the government get its money? Well, they also get money because I work, and they also get money because you work. And so they tax our income. And in 2018, fiscal year 2018, our income taxes here in North Carolina, the state of North Carolina collected $12.5 billion. Every time you go to the store and you purchase something, there's that sales tax that you pay to the state, to the county, all of those things. That sales tax was $7.3 billion in fiscal year 2018. I want you to look at the disparate amount that businesses paid in their corporate income tax. So whereas individuals paid $12.5 billion in income taxes, corporations paid $739 million in corporate income taxes. And there's also the franchise tax that is also a type of corporate tax, which was $669 million. But again, nowhere near the billions of dollars that individuals are charged. And the federal government provides 32% of North Carolina's funding. $16.3 billion comes from the federal government for a total of $22 billion. I don't know if those numbers really added up, but that's what it said on the slide.
They do. Well, it's the 22 billion is separate from the 16 billion that the federal government is giving.
Oh, okay. Because I was like, that seems a little excessive, but okay. But shout out to Daniel's old job, the North Carolina Justice Center, because if it wasn't for the North Carolina Justice Center and the Budget and Tax Center, I say this at the end on a slide, but I do want to say shout out to them because you will see us using the Justice Center slides throughout this presentation. Daniel, do you want to talk about the slide?
Sure, and this builds on what Christy just went over and really looks at North Carolina and compares it to both, other states in the South Atlantic, the South, and then also compared to the United States. And this does it on a per capita revenue, basically. So in North Carolina, when you look at sort of state and local revenues per person, how do you compare it to both other southern states and then the entire country? And you see that for that first bar with the federal transfers, that's the money, the federal money that Christy was talking about, that we actually get more than some other states do, but less than the U.S. average. Right there they have individual income taxes. You can see that we actually get more revenue per capita than other southern states, but less than the U.S. as a whole. General sales tax, it looks like we're about equal with the rest of the South, but apparently, have less revenue per capita than from general sales tax compared to the average in the U.S. And I think one of the biggest difference is with property taxes, where per capita we have a significantly less revenue generated based on property taxes in North Carolina than either other southern states and especially generally around the U.S. And you can see that, toward Christy's point, we do get a lot less of our revenue from corporate income taxes. That's, the corporate income tax in North Carolina has been drastically lowered during, the last few years of Republican leadership. but again, that's a relatively small portion of revenue that's generated.
Thank you for that, Daniel. So North Carolinians also pay local taxes, such as property taxes that fund local services like police and fire protection, education, and road maintenance. Revenue from local taxes and services are not part of the state budget. Cities and counties have their own budgets, but we will get into that later. So I want to debunk a myth that there are non-taxpayers in our community. Everyone who resides, who travels through, who comes to North Carolina is a taxpayer. If they stop and purchase gas, if they live here, if they are a community member, they are a taxpayer. Some people pay taxes when they earn income. We all pay taxes when we buy things, and we all own those of us who own property pay taxes on the property that we own. And that includes vehicles, that includes homes, land, boats, RVs, motorcycles, all the things that we own are taxed. So decisions about the state tax code are as important as the decisions about how to spend those dollars. The state tax code decides how much of us contributes as individuals or businesses. It also determines what form those taxes will take, such as incomes, sales, or property taxes. So the way the state generates revenue impacts North Carolinians differently along the income ladder. That's why it's important, it is crucial that our revenue structure follows three central values. It must be equitable, it must be adequate, and it must be stable. So we're going to go through these tax systems really quickly so that you have a baseline understanding, because this will become relevant as we continue our conversation about North Carolina. So regressive tax systems are systems that require low and middle income families to pay a higher share of their income in taxes than upper income families. Sales taxes, excise taxes, and property taxes tend to be regressive. Proportional or flat tax systems take the same share of income from all families. And then progressive tax systems require upper income families to pay a larger share of their incomes in taxes than those with lower incomes, and personal income taxes are usually progressive. But there are some takeaways from North Carolina's tax code. North Carolina has a flat income tax rate. And as of 2019, North Carolina's taxes income after deductions at 5.25%. And this is down from where it was just a year before that. And the flat structure is different from the graduated income tax rate structure that was in place before 2013. That structure applied higher tax rates on income over specific thresholds. Daniel, do any of these dates correlate to anything that you can think of in the legislature around when the tax code began to change and things like that?
Sure. Sorry, I did not mean to go off camera there. If you can let me back on, I'm glad to join again. Yeah, I mean, that was, establishing a flat tax for personal income, and then also, making it so that lowering the corporate income tax were, two of the highest priorities of Republican leadership. And so, that was a battle that happened in 2013, as you said there, 2013. And whenever we have additional revenue, like right now in the budgets, they've tried to add additional tax breaks. And so, that is a philosophy of the Republican leadership in North Carolina, is to return revenues to individual payers by having tax cuts whenever there is sort of a certain threshold of revenue.
Thank you for that. Another takeaway is that North Carolina maintains spending through the tax code that isn't consistently evaluated for public benefit. Our state budget is not just about the dollars that are appropriated through approval of the General Assembly, but it should also include consideration of the automatic spending that happens through the credits and deductions offered to individuals and corporations through the tax code. These tax breaks represent a significant annual loss of revenue. We are leaving money, as Daniel would say, on the table here in North Carolina. In addition to holding on and to the money that we do get and not being really resistant into funding a lot of the publicly beneficial things that people oftentimes push for. North Carolina also limits the revenue options available to local governments, which leads to those local governments relying primarily on state revenue sources to fund public services. While the state responsibility to fund public programs and services provides an opportunity to achieve greater equity so that low wealth communities aren't limited by the resources they have immediately available, it also creates challenges when local governments have increased responsibility for meeting community needs or different priorities than how state funding aligns. So basically, a local community becomes very dependent on the state for what it needs, for its funding needs, but the state also is able to dictate where the money goes, even if the community has a differing need. And so that's why you see the police being fully funded in lots of communities and law enforcement, but our public schools not having air conditioning or heating, and our school buses being dilapidated, school teachers being underpaid, not having universal health care. So North Carolina's current tax, oh, go ahead, Daniel.
Well, it's actually worse in North Carolina because, we don't have home rule in local jurisdictions. And so, it's not like there's necessarily a pot of money that no matter what the state can't get its hands on because, local authorities have generated that through its own sort of independent power base. In North Carolina, all power is sort of derivative of state, it sort of comes from state government. And so even where there is, a locality that is able to have, to generate revenue, there's always a risk of the state government tampering with it, trying to pull it back or limit sort of how much can be generated. And we even saw this come up this session with Senate Bill 100, which was actually a bill that limited and would have penalized local governments that tried to lower the budget of their police force. And we saw state government putting in a bill or state legislators putting in a bill that say that they would lose their money if they did that. And so, that bill did not advance, but it was enough that it was sort of a signal to local governments not to take more aggressive actions.
Yes. Thank you for making it relevant to recent events in North Carolina, Daniel. So North Carolina's current tax code is regressive. Remember, we talked about what regressive means a few slides ago. That means that it asks more from low income taxpayers as a share of their income than high income taxpayers. I want y'all to remember that for later, because again, North Carolina's current tax code is regressive. So again, this is just a slide that demonstrates basically what I just told you, that North Carolina to ask taxpayers with the lowest income to pay the greatest share of their annual income. And that is pretty bad. And the majority of the state's investments go to education and health and human services. And so you see that 39% of the budget goes to K through 12, 17% goes to higher education through public universities and I would say like community colleges, health and human services, which is like our Medicaid and our hospital systems, public funded hospital systems, justice and public safety, which are all of our courts, state troopers, FBI, all of the, DPS, Department of Public Safety, people, prisons. Then you have general government, which is like just, I guess, the running of the government day to day, Daniel, like just the administrative functionings. And then you have natural and economic resources. So that's like the forests and the rivers and making sure that the environment is taken care of. And so we see that the least amount of money is spent on natural and economic resources, and a pretty good amount of money is spent on justice and public safety as we compare it to the other categories. What do you think about this pie chart, Dan?
It's one of those things that it's misleading because you're like, oh, wow, like that's really good that the state spends so much on K through 12 education. They must have their priorities right. And, you'll see later on that that's not the case.
Thank you for foreshadowing that. So who makes these decisions, y'all? And if you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the roles of government and the role of legislature and how a bill becomes law. And so We're going to kind of briefly go through the steps along North Carolina's budget path. So step one is the budget request instructions are sent to the agencies in early fall. So that's like happening right now. Well, it would have been happening last year, right, Daniel? This time last fall, that the governor would provide state agencies with instructions for budget requests. The second step would be all those agencies then create their budgets. So they prepare their budget requests and submit them for review. The Office of the State Budget and Management and the NCGA's Fiscal Research Division both provide projected revenue collections for the upcoming fiscal year. Then the governor prepares his or her budget proposal, and the governor and the Office of State Budget and Management work with state agencies over the winter to prepare the state budget proposal. So it starts in the fall, moves through all the agencies. The winter, we begin to look at the governor begins to prepare the state budget proposal. Step 4, each chamber of the legislature creates its own budget. So now the governor's created a budget, the agencies have created a budget that they funnel to the governor. The governor has what he believes, him and his folks in his cabinet believe should be the budget. But then you get 2 more budgets. You get one from the House, one from the Senate. And the budget process switches its starting point between chambers every 2 years. Now that I did not know, I just learned by reading this entire slide. I think I did know, but I forgot it. So for 2 years, the House will release its budget first. And for the next 2 years, the Senate will. So where are we right now, Daniel, in that? Who released it first this year? Do you remember
The
at
Senate.
all? Or so much has happened, we can't remember. They did, okay.
Yeah, as I recall, it was a Senate this year.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, but you can see that we're in October of, when this started in October of last year, and we still don't have a budget, when the fiscal year started in July. And so, again, this is one of those things of this shows you, and everything is accurate here, but it gets very messy. And generally, they don't even, in the past, they have not even really consulted with the governor. But one thing that we see this year is that, they are, Republican leaders are working with Governor Cooper and being more collaborative than they have in the past. In past years, it's all been about Medicaid expansion. So, yeah, but that seems to not be as much of a deal breaker for the governor this year. And also Republican leaders are just willing to work with him more.
Well, that's good news. So we have some more steps. Like Daniel said, it gets messy. So after each chamber creates their budget, and whoever's in charge releases theirs first, depending on whose 2 years it is. Then it goes to the appropriations subcommittee. So there's a legislative appropriations process. So a handful of leaders in each chamber will make decisions about the biggest spending items. Appropriations subcommittees usually determine funding for the rest of the budget. Then each chamber of the legislature approves its own budget. So in this 2-year period, the House approves its budget and passes it on to the Senate. The Senate reviews this budget and votes on it, and vice versa. When it's the Senate, the Senate will approve its own budget, pass it over to the House, and then it has to be reviewed by the House, and then the budget is voted on. Then the governor decides whether or not, just like a bill, he's gonna sign that budget or not. He or she is going to sign that budget. The governor can sign the budget. They can allow the budget to become law without his or her signature. Is it still 10 days, Daniel, to not sign the budget? Okay, or they can. Okay, or they can veto the budget. So if you were here with us when we talked about how a bill becomes a law, you can see that bills become laws, our tax codes become laws, but the budget that we pass also goes through that similar process of going through both sides, and ultimately the governor approving or vetoing the budget. So the House and the Senate each vote to approve the final budget version. State agencies and the Office of the State Budget and Management implement the new budget. And that's how a budget is made here in North Carolina.
So this adds a little bit of detail to a slide that we had earlier. And this is, what shows, if you look at the pie chart, that K through 12 spending is, the largest portion of expenditures in North Carolina state budget. But when you compare it to the per capita expenditure of other southern states and of the United States, you see how much underinvestment is actually occurring, where, for every $1,500 of expenditure for the K through 12 education in North Carolina, there's $1,750 in other southern states and more than 2,000 on average in the United States. And so what we see is other states spending a much more significant portion of their state budget on K through 12 education. You see the same things with public welfare, especially compared to the US. We actually do better in health and hospitals. I would imagine that that's about our university system, because we also see a bigger rate of investment in higher education. And you can see these reflected. Obviously we're renowned for RTP in our universities. And so, when you invest in something, it has a better chance of actually flourishing. And so that's what we see reflected here. And then you see that despite our underinvestments compared to other southern states in the US in K through 12 education and public welfare, we basically pay the same per capita expenditures for law enforcement and for corrections. So that's, you see the same level of investment here that you would see in other places. And I'll stop there. Well, actually, one thing I do want to mention is I think Christy's fleeing from the lobby of the hotel. But, when you talked about Senator Marcus earlier, it is important to acknowledge that as much as a budget is about revenues and expenditures, that it's also about politics and policy. And so, obviously money and investment is in and of itself about policy, but sometimes what you also see in there is something that's not even really related to money, and it's just a policy that's put there. So that's the other thing that sort of complicates this interchange between the House leadership, the Senate leadership, and the governor, especially where it's split between parties. Christy?
Yeah, thank you for pointing out, Daniel, that it's not as cut and dry as the slides would make it seem. It's laid out pretty clearly, but as all things in politics, it gets really messy when we have people who have their own agendas that may or may not match the agenda of their community. It may very well, or when people aren't really respective of the process. And there are lots of ways to kill what you don't like and to give life to the things that you do like at the General Assembly. There's lots of energy for that. And there's lots of energy to bypass the normal channels or even proper channels of getting things done. And so this, again, lends to when we talk about manufactured scarcity. I know that can sound like very strong language, but what is happening with precision, and it's not by chance, it's not by coincidence. It is literally like the gerrymandering here in North Carolina, by design, with surgical precision. And I'll never forget the words of that. I don't know if it was a justice, Daniel, or the judge who wrote that decision, talking about gerrymandering being so precise and being racially motivated. And so a lot of the public policy in North Carolina is racially motivated, as we can see by the racial disparities in the criminal legal system and in our schools and all the other systems.
And generally you do see, that's a trend that social scientists have pointed out, is the difference is you see this where there is a larger Black population, that you see a state less willing to invest in communal resources like public welfare, like public schools. And instead you see, in one aspect you've seen in North Carolina is investment in charter schools. And that's been, the vouchers have been a really contested and just heated issue on both sides. But again, that was sort of one of the earliest debates about budgeting, because that's what it really is about. It's about, do you keep revenue and money in the sort of public system, or do you allow people to take public funds and invest it in a quasi-private entity like a charter school? And so, those debates still rage today.
And we will get into that kind of conversation, Daniel, here in just a little bit when we really talk about manufacturer scarcity for just a moment. So we're going to talk briefly about city and county budgets, y'all. I want you to know that there's not a huge difference between how a city or county comes up with this budget. It's pretty much the same way as it happens at the state legislature. As Daniel told you, because we are not a Dillon's rule, nor we're not clearly a Dillon's rule, nor clearly a home rule state, means that most of our counties, all of our counties are mostly funded, are totally funded by the state, and operate, all of 100 counties operate as like appendages of the state, I would say. Is that a good way to describe it, Daniel? And so because the state serves as the host, they have copied a lot of the processes that the state has. And so your county budget is determined by your board of county commissioners. And then your city budget is determined and decided and voted on by your city councilors or council people. And so the only difference between the city and the county is what they pay for. And so this next, we'll talk about it. But again, city and county budgets are voted on by individual city councils and county commissions and funded by local residents from the property sales and the other taxes that are there for charges and fees and any transfers from federal and state governments that they receive. And so the things that, hopefully you guys can see it, but the things that a city pays for, that a county must provide, is law enforcement. They must have a jail, they must have a medical examiner, they must have a court, they must have building code enforcement, they must have public schools, they must fund social services, public health, mental health, the Register of Deeds, the Board of Elections, and the tax assessor. Those are the things that a county must provide. Y'all, I don't know if you knew this or not, but the only thing that a city must provide is building code enforcement within the city. Everything else is like, they can or they cannot provide it. So the county may provide fire protective services. So like a fire department, if it's an unincorporated part of the county, they can provide that. So that's mostly like your volunteer fire departments are funded by the counties. Your water, sewer could, depending on where you live, solid waste collection, land use regulation, all of these things a county may provide if there are unincorporated parts of the county. But mostly the city provides things like the police, they provide the fire, streets, water, sewer, solid waste collection, land use regulation, like zoning. Land use regulation is like zoning. So they have all these different zones. You have zonings for houses, commercial, well, I guess it's residential, commercial, and then commercial can be broken down into all different ways. There's like industrial zones where you can have all types of stuff going on at that business and it can look all kinds of ways. And then you can have like business zoning where you have to have pretty trees in a certain kind of shrubbery, and it's kind of like a homeowners association for businesses within the city. Is how I would describe it. Your libraries are provided by your city and your county, city and county. Public health can be provided by a city. So again, all the things that you benefit from locally, your local property and sales taxes and any revenue that the state or the feds provide are what the city council and the county decide on. Daniel, is there anything you want to add about city council, city and county funding?
Well, it's just interesting because when you see a chart like this, like there's 5,000 stories just wrapped up in this, like just looking at it and thinking, why aren't streets something that a county must do or could do? And, and you can think about, transportation is like a very, you want to talk about political, transportation as a deep history of being political because it's about access. And especially, in the earlier years of our state, transportation decisions were, some of the most impactful out there. And so, it's just interesting to see what this really reflects is power dynamics. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to see it like that, and I'd love to just dive in. Maybe we have to do a whole nother webinar just on like what does this say? Because it's just interesting how it is all divided up.
Yeah. So hopefully, as we get deeper into the People's University, and people in local communities want to come together to learn more about their local city and county budget. And then potentially also folks wanting to learn about the state budget will get the opportunity to really all learn together in a popular education model where we're all teachers and we're all learners. Because y'all, Daniel and I, again, aren't experts on any of this. We are learning right along with you on a lot of this stuff. It is a lot of information. It is a lot to take in. It's a lot to digest. There's a lot to grapple with when you really think about how do you build power in your community? How do you take the information that you have and turn it into a strategy, into a tactic to really move the needle in a community? And so this is the type of information that we all have to have and share and learn and try to make sure that we're building upon so that we can build the power that we need to get the change that we would like to see within our community so that we can actually fund that change. So now we're getting to the juicy parts, Daniel. Oh, go ahead.
Well, and can I ask you, Christy, just what did you notice about the
Yeah.
jails when you were doing, your tour across the state, whether it was the Prison Solidarity Tour or the Confederate Monument Tour? Jails would seem to be a huge expenditure for local governments, and I'm constantly surprised how many new ones are, out there. And so, what did you see out there?
Well, yeah, so we saw jails and courthouses pretty much that had, really ornate in their design, really nice public spaces, which is really good. But when you think about, the harm that occurs in those spaces, we're spending an awful lot of money for people to be placed in a cage, or an awful lot of money for people to be separated from their family, awful lot of money for people to have some of the most racially disparate treatment that they'll ever receive. So we've spent a lot on marble and a lot on, again, really ornate architecture in these spaces.
Yeah.
A veneer of
respectability,
professional, and professionalism. But it really is some of the saddest places you could ever be are inside of courthouses, because unless someone is there to handle registering their property,
get married,
all of the businesses, and get married, or adopting someone, all other businesses is not good business, right? And so it's usually a fight on some level happening, whether it's a fight for your freedom or a fight for your child, a fight for your protective custody order, whatever. It's some angst along the way. And there just seems to be, at the local level and at the state level, a huge appetite to increase the expansion of jails and prisons in our state. There seems to be lots of space for that. But when we talk about something as simple as Medicaid for all, that doesn't cost us anything, costs nothing to the taxpayers, we're like, oh no, we can't do that. But something that costs taxpayers billions of dollars, we have all the energy for. So I think those are the types of things. And when I look at, as I sit here in New Bern in Pamlico County, where there is a Confederate monument outside of the courthouse, I think about the amount of money and care that is spent. When we were in Alamance County, that they had spent upwards of $70,000 to protect this monument. And Alamance County has one of the lowest per capita income, it's one of the poorest counties, but they can spend $70,000 for a Confederate monument to be protected. They can spend money on chemical munitions so that children marching and they get out to vote march can be pepper sprayed and tear gassed by police. They have endless dollars for that. But those same children needing to go to the doctor may not have medical coverage because a legislator decided that it was political whether they lived or their lungs were healthy or not. I think those things aren't lost on me. And as more and more people begin to learn about the budget, they'll understand that their situation in life is prescribed. It is a prescription by your local and state government, the quality of your life. It's prescribed by them. And so if the quality of your life sucks, it's not your own fault. It's not that you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's that you are the victim of a regressive tax. You are the victim of a tax code that does not prioritize equity, is not adequate or stable. And I think those reflections are the things that will help us really get the momentum that we need to reframe the narrative around what needs of the community need to be funded. And I think what we will see is that some communities have different priorities than other communities, that it won't be cookie cutter, that empowering a community to fund what it needs actually gets us to safer communities, because we're able to fully respond to the needs of the community rather than ignoring needs because we prioritize something else. So I think this is really setting us up to have good, tangible outcomes in the coming years as we have more informed people, not just working in the movement, but more informed people voting, more informed people just engaging in community in general. What say you, Dick?
I got you.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel. So that's the juicy part to me, Dave, manufacturer scarcity, because I feel like
Is your drop
not
kick
organic,
moment?
right? Right. Well, I just feel like this is the moment where we really drive it home what we mean by the divestment by our legislators and our local electeds, their divestment from community. So what is manufacturer scarcity? Well, Ruth Gilmore describes it as organized abandonment. And I thought that was such a profound statement, organized abandonment, which basically is economic and social policies which gut social welfare programs into what you heard Daniel say earlier. Places with high minority populations tend to gut those social welfare programs at a higher rate than those areas that don't have high minority populations. The privatization of public institutions, the charter schools that Daniel talked about earlier, and services. And they want to eliminate government regulation and redistribute resources into the hands of corporations in the name of efficiency and fiscal responsibility. Have we seen that, Daniel, happen in North Carolina at all?
Yes, that is. So. And it's like that moment when you wake up. I remember being like 14 and, everybody's talking about aspartame and Diet Coke killing your insides. And it's that moment where you just realize, what? Corporate America is not looking out for me. Isn't like, just making an okay product for me to use all the time. And it's very much, you see the same thing here that yes, this is not, that we need to be aware of this because your self-interest are not being protected here. And that when these funds are transferred over to corporate America, they're also not looking out for your corporate interest. And so, yes, we very much see this in North Carolina. Even, it's a bipartisan effort, but does seem to have gotten worse in the last decade.
I like that. That's Daniel's way of being shady, y'all. So in case you didn't catch the shade that Daniel just threw, he said it's a bipartisan effort. What that means is the Democrats and the Republicans are both guilty of this type of behavior. This is not an indictment of either side. And let me just remind people that the ACLU is a nonpartisan organization, right? So we indict people on either side of the aisle. If they ain't even on the aisle, but we indict folks because at the end of the day, we call ourselves the guardians of liberty. And so we try to remain true to that and call out people who deserve to be called out. And so that was Daniel's nice way of calling out Democrats and Republicans by saying that it's a bipartisan effort, this, as someone said in the chat, benevolent neglect. I like that. That was a good one. That's almost as good as organized abandonment. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, to be clear, we don't literally call ourselves guardians of liberty. I don't want that rumor to get started. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, that's
maybe
like
Christy
does. I don't know. The ACLU. I didn't mean we as in literally we. I mean the organization.
Yes, I just want to be very clear.
Guardian of Liberty. That's so hilarious. Okay, so what does organized abandonment or benevolent neglect in practice look like? It looks like increasingly precarious employment opportunities, housing. Y'all, I don't know if y'all know, but housing is so expensive and like scarce right now. It is ridiculous how much rent is, and then like the housing market is booming. It also looks like a precarious healthcare and care economies for a growing population a growing proportion of the population, but of course hitting low wealth families of color and people already struggling the hardest. Then policymakers use fees and fines on low income communities to make up revenue shortfalls that make poor people pay the most. Does that regressive tax sound familiar again? So here we are again, when policymakers use fees and fines and taxes on low income communities to make up for these revenue shortfalls. Yep. They make poor people pay the most and make poor people remain poor. And so when the inevitable fallout from this organized abandonment of the community begins, then we see this uptick in policing, criminalization, and incarceration as a response to the fallout from the divestment in the community. And so this is what we mean by its manufactured scarcity, because it was planned, this abandonment of the community was planned so that the investment could be in a more carceral, controlling state. And we have seen an increase and uptick in carcerality. The amount of laws that we have on our books today is astounding. Daniel, anything you wanted to add about this slide?
No, only that, well, I would say that fines and fees are, taxes only get lowered. Nobody really wants to be the Democrat or Republican wants to be the person who raises taxes. And so what you see is this constant sort of ratcheting down of taxes. And then like Christy said, when you actually do need money to fund the courts or to fund, everything, that's when, you don't get as much scrutiny if you increase a court fee from, $25 to $50. You generate a lot of money like that and you get away with not taxing people. But at the end of the day, that means that when somebody's going into court in North Carolina right now, they go in and get a traffic ticket. The ticket costs $10, but then the fees are $125, $150, and that just doesn't make sense to people. And so you see, you just see that working. And again, the reason they do that is to not have to raise taxes, but to still get money because it is, at the end of the day, a very regressive tax.
Right. And so again, low income and communities of color are hit the hardest when these fees and fines and general uptick in policing and criminalization and incarceration are deployed as a response. So in this context, police serve as the muscle of racial capitalism. Let me say that again. In this context, police serve as the muscle of racial capitalism. They charged with containing and controlling marginalized communities. So the demands that we heard last summer to defund the police are not simply about budget reallocation, y'all. They are ultimately about shifting power away from systems of punishment back into the hands of the communities where the harm is actually occurring. Let me read that to you again. Demands to defund the police are therefore not simply about the budget, it's about delegitimizing and shifting power away from systems of punishment and empowering the community to address the harm. So as we began the slow road to recovery from COVID-19, we have to recognize that the coronavirus didn't create the need to strengthen our public goods and services, but it starkly demonstrated the deadly and devastating impacts of organized abandonment of Black, Indigenous, migrant, queer, trans, and disabled communities of color. The past year has seen drastically increased demands for services and revealed how our past funding failures left state and local governments very ill-equipped to face a global emergency. It is a wake-up call for us to reimagine how we fund our public budgets. Coronavirus did not cause the issue. It only shed light on what had already been a growing, brewing issue across the country, but especially here in the South, and especially here in North Carolina for a long, long time. It's just exposed what we already knew. So, what's next, y'all? The next time Daniel and I see you, we will be talking about what is a people's budget. We talked about the state, they come up with their budget. The counties and the cities come up with their budget, the Senate and the chambers, the governor, all them people. But what is a people's budget? And what could that look like? What is our dream for our local communities? Does it mean divestment from police and sheriffs? And does it mean investment in the community? Remember, what is a city responsible for? And what is a county responsible for? And how do we prioritize what we invest our money in so that it actually reflects the values that we have about ourselves, our neighbors, and our community in general? Again, I have to thank everybody at the North Carolina Justice Center, but especially the Budget and Tax Center for all the resources, along with our partners, North Carolina SPAN and Charlotte for Black Futures. And we're going to take questions at this time if you have them for Daniel and I. I have not seen any questions. What I have seen is a lot of affirmations and a lot of folks putting examples of what organized abandonment in practice looks like. And somebody did a really good job of talking about housing, how we demolish low-income housing and replace it with mixed-income housing, which really takes away the low-income units in a community. And so if you create mixed housing and we go from 100 units that we had low-income housing and now it's mixed and only 30% of those units of those 100 now, which are 30 units for low income, it is a lot of displacement happening. And that's happening, gentrification is a big thing. Daniel, any final words? We're almost at time. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. That means y'all, that warms my heart because that means that we were thorough, that y'all understood what we were saying. We made it simple enough and we moved quickly enough to where you felt like you were able to digest it. So I really, really appreciate that. Daniel, any last words before we go?
We always like to talk about the Conference of DAs, and I would say that is a state entity that receives funding. And, as the governor and the legislative leaders meet to talk about the budget, which is happening right now, one of the issues that we're going to be raising up to them, and one of the asks is to actually look at, limiting their ability by limiting their finances to actually, be the problematic actors that we've seen them be in so many situations. And so even in that regard, that's another example of how profoundly important the budget is. And so, I appreciate you taking the time to walk through it with us, Christy.
Oh, we do have one question. What can we do to influence the budget? The number one thing you can do to influence a budget is to be knowledgeable about how the budget actually works and what is being funded. And so I encourage you to be on the lookout in your emails because we will be potentially sending out a survey. I think we're going to do the survey to see where people live, put people in cohorts who all live in the same area. And then we'll work with individual groups and in larger groups to work on tackling budgets in your local community. So if you're interested in the state budget, you could be in the state budget cohort. If you're interested in the local city, county, we can do that. We have lots of resources available to local folks to think about budget. But you're going to be starting now specifically for a very specific reason, because in January is when local communities begin working on the budget. So the mayor and the chair of the Board of County Commissioners will begin sending to the county and city managers, will begin sending out to departments, hey, what are your budgets? What for the year? And then by the summer is when those budgets will be voted on and finalized. And so we have a lot of opportunity between now and next summer to really impact budgets at the local level. The state level, that ship has sailed for this time, I would say, Daniel, or do you think people have an opportunity to really weigh in on this budget?
I think it is generally sailed. I will say that that in years past, there would be no real opportunity if you're putting out a progressive message. But this year, because they are involving Governor Cooper more in the conversation, I would say reach out to your legislator, if they're whether a Republican or a Democrat. Both of those have more access to the conversation than they've had in the past. And so, but again, I think it's very, like when you got the governor, Berger and Moore in a room, working out the details is pretty late in the process. But yeah, I think you could reach out to your legislator to lift up anything.
Yeah, and so another question is, I hear police budgets have increased instead of decreased. Is that true? In some areas that is, in some areas it may not be true, but there are specific ways that we will learn. There are specific tactics, especially if we're talking about police and sheriff budgets, to reallocate funding away from police. And so happy to talk to you all about that in the future as we move through the People's University. The dream is to create a people's budget for your local community that you work on to get a city council or a county commissioner to agree to present. And then we may get voted on. And so that's our goal. I live in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. My goal is to create a people's budget that we present to our city council to see if they can get it passed. And if they get that passed, then the people of Charlotte will have a budget that is reflective of the people. And so we may not, what we know about a campaign and what we know about movement work is that it's a movement, not a moment. That it may not get this go around, but we will continue to introduce those budgets and build power so that people get used to seeing us in the space. And just people being in the space asking appropriate questions is enough to influence a budget. I can tell you, just being in a space and asking appropriate questions and having information is a huge way to influence not just public policy, but the budget. And Daniel and I are happy to talk about how we do that. Sometimes we rhyme slow, sometimes we rhyme renegade. And so we are happy to lend all of the expertise that we've gained over the years doing this work to everyone on this call. So be on the lookout for your emails. We probably will not be convening that much because the holidays are coming up, but look for us to really hit the ground running. I'll send you some stuff in between time, in the meantime, for you to read and watch and get up on and be up on. But we will move to January to be back on these type of webinars where we'll really begin taking deep dives into your local budgets. All right, everybody. Until then, stay safe. Daniel and I really appreciate all the support. If you're not a member of the ACLU, please go to www.acluofnc.org/membership and join. It costs as little as $5. And your support and your membership is crucial to our ability to build power in the state of North Carolina. Have a good night. Signing off from Newborn.